In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the front brakes, pads, and rotors on this Lexus IS. Located right behind your front wheels, let's get started. With the vehicle safely raised and supported, use a 21mm socket and remove all 5 lug nuts and then pull the wheel off. Just as a tip, if your vehicle has locking lug nuts and the special key for it, don't use an impact on it, break it free by hand with a breaker bar, then finish removing it because the teeth on those little sockets can break. And remove your wheel. From the back side of the caliper, you'll see 2 14mm headed bolts. These hold the caliper onto the slider pins and therefore the bracket. So let's remove both of these so we can pull the caliper off. These shouldn't be very tight once you break them free. With those off, you should be able to move the caliper right off of the pads and the bracket. With it flipped around, inspect the boot for tears. If it's torn or if you see fluid leaking out, the caliper is bad. At this point, let's open up the bleeder screw so we can push this piston back all the way and not cause any damage by pushing fluid backwards through the line. So let's use a 10mm socket and get this broken free, but remove the rubber plug first, or the rubber cap. I'm just going to briefly somewhat re-secure it. In order to not spill fluid, I have a collection receptacle with a little hose on it, so I'm just going to use that. We'll break this free. It will be easier if I remove one of the pads, so just slide it out. And I'm going to insert it in the caliper just as a little spacer. Otherwise the tool, what happens is it tends to go inside the piston and it bottoms out, or the tool maxes out before the piston bottoms out. Now gently, slowly push this back. It should go smoothly. If it does not, that means the piston is seized. Mine just bottomed out. These pads are fairly new, so there wasn't a lot for this piston to go back in, but everything is good now. So let's flip this around. Again, we'll wait for any potential air bubbles to come out of the bleeder screw and tighten this back up. Just snug it. We'll let any of the extra drain into the collection bucket that I have here. Wipe this down. Use a little bit of brake parts cleaner to rinse this. And once you're done with this, cap it off. At this point, I'm going to put the caliper up and over the axle. I don't want to pull on this brake hose, so if I just rest it up there, it's going to stay out of my way without putting any pressure on this. Remove the other pad, and now use a 17mm socket and pull these 2 bolts out that hold the caliper bracket onto the knuckle. We'll thread this back in so I can hold it while we remove the lower. Remove both and pull your bracket right off. We'll set this aside so we can clean it and re-lubricate the pins. The rotor should come off at this point. However, mine is stuck. A lot of times that happens. It just rusts onto the hub. You have 2 options here. You could use 2 8x125 bolts and thread them in here, and that'll pop the rotor off. Or you could use a hammer or a rubber mallet and either hit between the lug studs or from the back side of the rotor, and that'll break it free. I'm just going to go for the hammer method. However, one thing that I want to do is put a lug nut back on so that if it pops off, it doesn't fall off. Just a few threads. Take your safety lug nut off and remove the rotor. We now have to clean the entire surface on the face of the hub so that the rotor can mount flat. There is a lot of corrosion or rust and debris here that I want to remove. Otherwise, the rotor and then the wheel won't mount evenly, so then you'll get vibrations as you drive, or pulsations really through the brake pedal. So use a sanding disc if it's in this bad of shape. If it's not, usually a wire brush will do the trick, or even a small wire wheel on a drill. Once again, I'm going to use a sanding disc and very gently sand this down. Once it's sanded down, rinse it off with brake parts cleaner and a collection bucket underneath to catch the fluid, and then cover it with a thin layer of anti-seize so it doesn't corrode in the future. Try to keep this layer as thin as possible so it doesn't squish and fling out after the rotor goes on. And also avoid getting it on the threads of the lug studs so that they stay dry. They're not supposed to be lubricated with anti-seize. Now take your rotor, and I like to mount it backwards to start so I can clean off this surface with some brake parts cleaner. I don't want any oils on here or potential fingerprints with grease or oil. So let's get a collection bucket underneath and rinse this down. There we go, flip this around. With it installed the right way, clean this surface up with brake parts cleaner as well. In order for the rotor to stay securely mounted and not move around while we do the rest of our brake job, I'm going to use an old axle nut and put a lug nut through it and just snug it up by hand. This will just hold it onto the hub once again so it doesn't move around. With our caliper on a workbench, let's remove the old anti-rattle clips. Just pry them off, and underneath it you'll see typically a little bit of rust and, well, quite a bit of brake dust. So take a wire brush and clean all of this off. Now sometimes it rusts so bad that it's swollen with rust and then you'd have to sand it or file it down. If you have to do that, be careful not to take off too much material because then the pads will have too much room to move around. That looks pretty good. I don't need to get it looking brand new. I just needed to remove the corrosion and the brake dust on there. So I'm going to coat this with a thin layer of silicone paste that is rated for brakes. It's important that if you do use silicone paste, it can withstand high temperatures because that's what the brakes operate at. And otherwise, if you don't use high temperature silicone paste, you could use brake grease. But if you use something with a low melting point, well, it's going to melt as the brakes operate. Take the new anti-rattle clip. They're all the same, all four of them, so it doesn't matter which one. Line it up and press it on until it locks in. Sometimes it helps to have the caliper upright so you can actually press these down. This one keeps wanting to pop up. That's okay, it's just because they're slightly spring-loaded here, and so I'm going to leave it. It is securely mounted. So let's do the same to the other side anti-rattle clip. Next, what we want to do is remove the slider pins from their mounting areas and double check the boots at the same time. Sometimes they get swollen or they tear. These seem like they're in good shape. There's still very good grease inside here, and I like to do these one at a time because one of them, this one in this case, has a rubber sleeve on it, like a little rubber damper, and you need to put it back in the same bore that it came out of. And this is here for some vibration dampening, so you want to make sure it goes back in the same way the manufacturer intended it. I'm going to use a rag and wipe off all of the old grease that's on here, and because this is still good grease, I'm not too worried about cleaning inside of the caliper bracket. I would be if this was rusted or if the boot was bad, but in my case, I'm just going to do my best to clean around from the outside and leave it at that. I'm going to stick my rag inside the boot and just pull out some of the old grease that I can see in here so we can apply some new grease. Try to avoid using brake parts cleaner on these rubber boots because that is what ends up swelling them and then they don't seal up anymore. That looks pretty good right there. So I'm going to take some silicone paste on my brush and put it right inside the boot. This is going to act almost like a reserve of grease over time as the brakes operate. And I will put the rest of what's on my brush directly on the slider pin. You just can't put too much on here because it's a pretty tight fit, and what happens is it all gets pushed out as you put the slider pin in, so that's why I put some inside the boot. I'm also going to add some right up here on this ridge on the slider pin so that it can seal up on this boot. Now, slide the pin in, push it in all the way. Sometimes there's air stuck right here and it's trapped, so what you can do is push the pin and squeeze the boot at the same time. If you push it enough times, what happens is the air gets pushed out of here into the boot area, and then squeezing the boot makes it come out. And that right there is perfect. Wipe off any excess grease and then flip it around, and we'll do the same to the other side. Get your caliper bracket over the rotor and lined up with the knuckle. Have at least one bolt ready so you can start this on. That way it can stay attached. And then once you have that threaded on partially, start in the other bolt. Snug these up. These bolts, if you can see, they have 2 marks on the head of the bolt. If your bolts have 2 marks, they'd get torqued to 100 foot-pounds. These are the bracket to knuckle bolts. If they only have 1 mark, it's 58 foot-pounds. So because I have 2 marks, I'm going to torque these 2 bolts to 100 foot-pounds. All right, those are tight. Put your pads on. It does not matter which one goes where because these do not have a wear indicator on them. So slide them in at an angle and then push them in and make sure that they go on properly, are secured top and bottom, and that they can move around smoothly. This one actually moves so smooth that it just popped out. That's normal. If they don't and it takes extra pressure to put them in, that means the anti-rattle clips are squeezing them because there's rust underneath them. So you're gonna have to take everything back off and clean some more. Mine are good to go, so I will mount the caliper next. Slide the caliper over the pads and over the slider pins with it lined up. Secure it with the 2 bolts from the back. And we'll torque these to 25 foot-pounds. Start on all 5 lug nuts. We'll bottom them out in a cross pattern, and also in a cross pattern, we'll torque all of them to 76 foot-pounds. If your vehicle has the locking lug nuts with the key, be very, very careful with these. I don't recommend using a power tool on them. I'm going to use one just to slowly bottom it out, but I'm not going to impact through this adapter because the teeth on the backside can very easily break. Once again, 76 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Double check them all. Remove your tool if you had one of these here. Now pump up the brake pedal, top off the master cylinder, and take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.